A cold rain drifted over Washington on the morning of October 3, 1945, the kind that blurs the edges of monuments and makes even marble look uncertain. It tapped against the windows of the White House's West Wing, a steady, wavering rhythm, like fingers drumming on a desk while someone searches for courage. Somewhere deep inside the building, under dim lamps and cigar-thick air, a president no one expected to rule was preparing for a decision no one believed he would dare make. Harry S. Truman, the quiet Missourian who had spent most of his career fighting corrupt politicians and refusing favors, now found himself holding the weight of a fractured world. 6 months after Franklin D. Roosevelt's death, he was still a man living in another president's shadow, working in another man's office, inheriting another man's war, shaping policy with advisors who whispered, "That's not how FDR would have done it." And yet this morning felt different. There was a tremor in the air, a sense that something hidden was about to surface. Across town, in an office of polished oak and fading ambition, Henry A. Wallace, Roosevelt's former vice president and the man many liberals once believed would lead America into a new age, was drafting a speech that he believed could save the world, or divide it forever. The contradiction of his life was simple. He had been chosen to stand one heartbeat away from the presidency under Roosevelt, yet now he stood one sentence away from being cast out by Truman. This was the tension that defined their story. On one side, a gentle dreamer, a spiritual idealist who believed that cooperation could tame the storms of geopolitics. Wallace saw humanity as a canvas, its future painted by dialogue, disarmament, and shared prosperity. He thought the Soviets could be partners, not rivals. He believed America could win peace not through strength, but through understanding. On the other, a practical realist, a man shaped by wars, economic collapse, and hard bargains struck in Kansas City backrooms. Truman didn't trust illusions, and he trusted Stalin even less. To him, power, military, political, and moral, was the only language the post-war world would understand. And so, just months after the victory parades ended, America faced a new kind of conflict. Not a battle of armies, but a battle of visions. The United States stood at a crossroads. The ashes of World War II had barely cooled, yet the embers of a new ideological confrontation were already glowing. Truman's cabinet meetings grew more tense, his advisors split between conciliators and hardliners. And at the center of the storm stood Henry Wallace, still popular, still eloquent, still a symbol of the Roosevelt era. But history has a cruel sense of irony. The man who had once been revered as the progressive heartbeat of the New Deal now threatened Truman's ability to define America's post-war strategy. Wallace's radio addresses, speeches, and growing public influence risked undermining the fragile unity Truman needed. And Truman, the underestimated, overlooked, accidental president, realized he could no longer govern with a ghost of Roosevelt whispering through his corridors. So on that wet October morning, Truman prepared to make the most dramatic political break of his young presidency. He would dismiss Roosevelt's vice president from his cabinet, just 6 months after FDR himself left the stage. The misconception of the moment was powerful. Many Americans believed Truman was simply continuing Roosevelt's legacy. Instead, he was preparing to reshape it. What looked like continuity was about to become rupture. What sounded like loyalty was about to become defiance. What seemed like cooperation was about to become a declaration of ideological war. As the rain thickened and the lamps flickered, the contradictions of the age sharpened into focus. The peaceful promise of the post-war world stood against the rising certainty of global division. Idealism collided with realism. Diplomacy collided with strategy. And two men who once served the same president found themselves walking in opposite directions along the same hallway. This is the story of that fracture. Of how Truman rose out of Roosevelt's shadow. Of how Wallace fell out of power. Of how a nation discovered that victory in war does not guarantee unity in peace. And ultimately, it is a story about something deeper, about the fragile nature of leadership, the cost of conviction, and the moment America chose its path into the Cold War. Because in the end, Truman's dismissal of Roosevelt's vice president wasn't just a political decision. It was the opening move in a new global struggle. Act I, build up, the shadow of a fallen giant. When Franklin Delano Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, the world staggered. He had been the captain navigating the storm for 12 years, through economic devastation, through rising fascism, through the darkest nights of World War II. No president since Lincoln had carried a heavier burden. And suddenly, the man who inherited it all was a former haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, a man who had only met FDR twice before the election. In the cabinet room, Truman faced a team of officials who had been loyal to Roosevelt for over a decade. Most were scholars or seasoned bureaucrats from elite institutions. Truman was none of those things. He was blunt, practical, plain-spoken. But one figure in the room stood out more than the rest. Henry Wallace, the man who had served as FDR's vice president from 1941 to 1945. Wallace was a paradox. An intellectual mystic from Iowa, a scientist who read poetry, a political leader who believed history followed spiritual rhythms. He saw the Soviet Union not as a threat, but as a misunderstood ally. In 1944, he had nearly been renominated as vice president. If he had succeeded, he would have become president after Roosevelt's death. And that was precisely the problem. Truman needed authority. Wallace had popularity. Truman needed unity. Wallace had independent influence. Truman needed control over foreign policy. Wallace wanted his own diplomatic revolution. By the summer of 1945, Truman was working to define America's role in a post-war world. He approved the use of atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He spoke sharply against Soviet expansion in Eastern Europe. He began envisioning a long-term strategy of containment. Wallace, meanwhile, saw the atomic bomb as a moral catastrophe. He believed it would push the world into a spiral of fear. He urged cooperation with Moscow, arguing that war emerged only from misunderstanding. The contradictions were no longer theoretical. They were operational. The cabinet was splintering. Act 2, Turning Point, the speech that changed everything. The decisive moment came on September 12, 1946 at Madison Square Garden. Wallace delivered a speech broadcast nationwide, in which he publicly challenged the administration's approach to the Soviet Union. He accused Truman's advisors, particularly Secretary of State James Burns, of fueling unnecessary confrontation. He declared, "We have no right to drive the world toward conflict through insistence on our own narrow view of security." The crowd roared. Newspapers exploded. The Soviet press reprinted the speech within hours. In one stroke, Wallace had crossed a line that cabinet members rarely dare to cross. He publicly contradicted his own president on foreign policy. Truman was furious. Advisors pressed him, "If Wallace stays, you lose credibility at the negotiating table." The State Department warned that allies were confused. Who spoke for the United States, Truman or Wallace? For Truman, the dilemma was more than political. It was personal. He respected Roosevelt, but he could not govern as Roosevelt's echo. So he summoned Wallace to the Oval Office. The details differ depending on the memoir, but most recall a quiet conversation. Truman spoke plainly, explaining that Wallace's speech had jeopardized the administration's diplomatic standing. Wallace, principled and calm, refused to recant. And so Truman made the hardest decision of his presidency so far. He dismissed his Commerce Secretary, Roosevelt's former vice president, just 174 days after FDR's death. Act 3, Confrontation. Reports, memos, and private warfare. The nation woke to headlines. Wallace removed. Truman strikes break with New Deal liberals. Cabinet erupts over Soviet policy. Behind the scenes, the confrontation grew even sharper. State Department telegrams described Soviet diplomats celebrating Wallace's popularity. FBI reports noted mass mail campaigns supporting Wallace. The White House switchboards flooded with letters, half praising Truman for courage, half accusing him of betraying Roosevelt's legacy. Diaries recorded the tension. Burns wrote, "Wallace is a good man with dangerous ideas." Wallace wrote in his journal, "I speak not against Truman but against fear." And Truman privately confided, "The presidency cannot be run by two men." The break was complete. Act 4, Human Element, Fragments from a Divided Nation. Radio broadcasts captured the uncertainty. Some wonder if this marks the end of the New Deal spirit. The president signals a tougher line abroad. Henry Wallace remains a voice for peace. In Iowa, a farmer wrote to Wallace, "You were the last voice of Roosevelt." In Kansas City, a veteran wrote to Truman, "We fought to stop tyranny. Don't let Stalin replace Hitler." Even within households, arguments flared, idealism versus realism, cooperation versus security. The scars of war were still fresh, and the fear of a new conflict already hovered in the air. Act V, Consequences, the Cold War crystallizes. Within months of Wallace's dismissal, Truman's new foreign policy hardened into what would become known as containment. American strategy moved from hopeful partnership to guarded vigilance. Budgets shifted toward military readiness. Alliances evolved from wartime necessity to ideological networks. Between 1947 and 1949, the Truman Doctrine pledged support to Greece and Turkey. The Marshall Plan rebuilt Western Europe to resist Soviet influence. The Berlin airlift defied Stalin's blockade. NATO was formed to defend against potential aggression. Wallace, meanwhile, became a symbol for the left, beloved, criticized, idealized, and marginalized. He ran for president in 1948 under the Progressive Party, winning just over 1 million votes. In numerical terms, Wallace lost. In ideological terms, he revealed a deep fracture in American hopes for peace. And Truman, ruling decisively, secured the direction of American foreign policy for decades. Act 6, Reflection, the redefinition of American power. The firing did not merely end a political partnership. It defined the psychological boundary between the world that Roosevelt built and the world Truman would navigate. Roosevelt had fought fascism. Truman would confront communism. Roosevelt built the arsenal of democracy. Truman built the architecture of the Cold War. And Wallace? He became the lost prophet of an unrealized future, a reminder of what might have been had idealism triumphed over caution. It was not simply a clash of policies. It was a clash of worldviews, each rooted in genuine visions of peace, each shaped by the trauma of war. In the end, both men were right in different ways. And both were wrong in ways they could not foresee. When historians look back on the autumn of 1946, they see more than a political firing. They see the moment when America crossed a threshold, from the hopeful unity of wartime victory into the anxious vigilance of the Cold War. The dismissal of Henry Wallace was not an isolated decision. It was the symbolic break between two visions of humanity's future. In the months that followed, Truman often reflected on the choice. He insisted it was necessary. And perhaps it was. The world was reorganizing itself into rival spheres. The Soviet Union tightened its grip on Eastern Europe. The atomic age introduced a scale of fear previously unimaginable. Diplomacy, once built on trust, now required suspicion. But Wallace, too, carried a truth that the nation would rediscover decades later. That power without empathy becomes fragility, and that security built only on strength can become its own prison. There is an irony in their conflict. Truman, the realist, feared that Wallace's idealism would lead America into vulnerability. Wallace, the idealist, feared that Truman's realism would lead the world into perpetual fear. And in their own ways, both men were proved right. Truman's firm stance helped contain Soviet expansion, preserving democratic Europe. Wallace's warnings foreshadowed the arms race, the nuclear brinkmanship, and the psychological cost of living under constant threat. As the Cold War deepened, the nation began to understand the magnitude of the moment they had lived through. The dismissal was not about one speech, one disagreement, or one man. It was about how a superpower chooses its identity. The legacy of that choice endures. Today, America's foreign policy still wrestles with the same tension. Idealism versus realism, cooperation versus deterrence, hope versus caution. The ghosts of 1946 still whisper in every debate over diplomacy, defense spending, and global alliances. And the emotional imprint remains as well. Truman's firing of Roosevelt's former vice president reminds us that leadership is often lonelier than we imagine. That sometimes keeping the world stable requires decisions that fracture friendships, challenge loyalties, and define eras. One image from the story lingers: rain tapping against the White House windows on that October morning, as Truman prepared to dismiss a man he respected but could no longer follow. It is a symbol of history's most enduring truth. Power is never peaceful. It demands choices that wound as much as they protect. But another image remains as well: Wallace standing before a crowd, speaking not to governments but to humanity's better angels. It reminds us that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of understanding. In the end, this story reveals something universal. That the future is always shaped by tension, between fear and faith, strength and compassion, caution and courage. And it reminds us of a final truth, echoed across the decades. A nation's destiny is never written by one leader alone, but by the clash of visions that challenge it, refine it, and force it to grow. That is why Truman quickly dismissed Roosevelt's vice president. Not out of anger or ambition or revenge, but because history demanded a choice. And the world we live in today still carries the imprint of that choice.